Today, when conjuring in the mind images of the Second Great War, few will fail to recognize the name, let alone the distinctive sound, of the AVRO Lancaster. The AVRO Lancaster, of which there are only 2 flying survivors, is probably the most famous of all wartime aircraft. Its many and varied exploits deep into enemy territory put fear into the very hearts of those unfortunate enough to be beneath its rain of bombs. One could be forgiven for thinking such a machine to be the product of an aggressive company managed by aggressive men. Not so. It was the product of a company whose humble beginnings began with one of the most unassuming pioneers of aviation, AVRO.
Many men, inspired by the potential of flight, had joined AVRO in the early years. None more famous or deserving of more recognition than he finally received for the design of the inimitable Lancaster than Roy Chadwick, who designed and built the Lancaster under strange circumstances on the very site that Roe had purchased in 1925, before selling the controlling interest to S.E. Saunders, the long-established company specializing in flying boats.
As a young man, Roy Chadwick was undoubtedly influenced by Roe, his early gliding achievements and eventual first flight made in Great Britain in 1908. His first experiments with flight followed the same pattern, as Margaret Dove, his daughter, explains.
When he was about 10 years old, my father began to make model aircraft. He said that at first these models would not fly, but that he soon began to make models which would fly, and some which made quite long flights. But he said himself that aviation was in its very earliest days, and people didn't really know what he was doing, so he preferred to fly his aircraft under cover of darkness.
AVRO moved to larger premises at Brownsfield Mills, Manchester, and still following his successes with more than a passing interest, Chadwick attended evening classes at the Manchester College of Technology, completing his engineering apprenticeship at British Westinghouse. This, the fascination of flight, and his reverence for AVRO was soon to shape his entire life.
As his apprenticeship was drawing to a close at the end of 1911, my father felt more and more that his future lay with aviation. He said that he had got to know Sir Elliot Roe, and I think he may have met him at air meetings which were taking place all over the country at that time. So he went to Brownsfield Mill to ask for an interview with the great pioneer, and Humphrey Burton Roe met him and arranged for an interview for the following week when Sir Elliot engaged my father as his personal assistant.
At this time, with war on the horizon, aircraft design was in its infancy. Moving to the greater capacity Park Works, Roy Chadwick was instrumental in the design of a revolutionary series of AVRO aeroplanes, the 500s. The most famous of these was the AVRO 504, which was to carry out the first bombing raid on Germany when it attacked the Zeppelin sheds at Friedrichshafen. It was 1914. Chadwick was just 21. And already he commanded a workforce of 100 men.
In 1917, there was a need for expansion of the floor space to accommodate the large number of AVRO 504s which were being produced. Over 8,000 were produced between 1914 and 1918. And Sir Elliot decided to establish an experimental station at Hamble, on the Southampton Water, a beautiful site which he had bought. And on the opening day, I have read that after the opening ceremonies, Sir Elliot and my father, who both owned motorbikes, treated the assembled guests to a display of trick cycling, which ended with Sir Elliot riding down a flight of stairs on his motorbike.
Chadwick and Roe became inseparable, the closest of friends. Chadwick, the most trusted of the by now huge workforce, not only designed but flew the rapid succession of successful AVRO aeroplanes. The 549 Aldershot, in its day the most powerful single-engine aircraft in the world. And the Manchester itself, a massive heavy bomber making its debut in 1918, just too late to prove itself in the war. The AVRO Baby, the world's first truly light aeroplane that flew for the first time in 1919, and which, a year later, almost killed Chadwick.
In 1921, my father designed another small aeroplane. This was the AVRO Antarctic, which he designed for the last expedition to the Antarctic of the great Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. But the aeroplane was a variant of the AVRO Baby with floats so that it could land on the water and folding wings so that it could be winched aboard Sir Ernest's vessel, the Quest.
It was the time of pioneers and planes for pioneers. Shackleton had taken AVRO's name to the Antarctic, and Bert Hinkler, in an AVRO Avian, had taken it to Australia. It was now at its peak that AVRO sold the controlling interest. For Roy Chadwick, it was a sad time, for although he would remain in constant touch with AVRO, it was to be the end of their working relationship. AVRO's moved back to Manchester, and now, under the managing directorship of Roy Dobson, who had himself joined AVRO in the early years, a new and exciting era began.
So my father and Roy Dobson, the two Roys as they were called, began to work in close harmony, and it was this close cooperation between these two great men that made the AVRO company the wonderful company that it was during the war. My father running the design and Sir Roy the production.
The ill-fated Geneva Disarmament Conference of 1932 has long since broken up, and Adolf Hitler, clearly bent on a program of rearmament, has firmly established his power as Chancellor of Germany. By 1935, Hitler's rearmament in the air had proceeded much farther and faster than the British government had imagined possible. And March of that year saw the birth of the Luftwaffe. Both Hitler and Goering boasted it already equaled the Royal Air Force. An alarmed British government ordered quantity production of Hurricanes and Spitfires, virtually off the drawing board, long before they'd ever flown. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain continues to pursue diplomatic solutions to the European crisis. But by 1938, the storm clouds were gathering as Hitler rattled his sword at Czechoslovakia. His generals, opposed to a confrontation, persuade the Führer to hold a summit conference, and the British government agreed at the conference in Munich that large areas of Czechoslovakian land be annexed. Chamberlain returns to England, hailing that September conference as the harbinger of peace in our time. Great Britain declares war on Germany at 11 a.m. on September the 3rd, 1939. Father of the Royal Air Force, Lord Trenchard, always maintained that a war would be better fought with a bomber force powerful enough to take the offensive to the enemy's vital centers. But in 1939, Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt was forced to face the bitter truth that his air force of bombers were few in number. Only one heavy bomber had reached the squadrons, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. Others, much lighter, included the Fairey Battle, the Bristol Blenheim, the Handley Page Hampden, and just entering service, the Wellington. Having considered the tools at hand, Ludlow Hewitt was impelled to declare that any attempt to raid deep into enemy territory might well lead to a major disaster. But the Air Ministry had recognized the limitation as long ago as 1936, and as a result, two new specifications were issued. One, which emerged in 1940 as the Halifax, and the other, a twin-engined medium bomber, which emerged as the forerunner of today's Shackleton, the infamous Manchester. Arthur T. Harris was about to take up the post of Commander-in-Chief, Bomber Command.
Well, the Manchester turned out to be a complete failure. And the reason it was a failure was it was underpowered with its two engines. It didn't want to fly at all on one engine, and the failure rate was really becoming intolerable. I flew one once, I didn't like it, and then we were faced with the fact that here was a modern bomber aircraft on which we were really depending for our bomber efforts in the beginning of the war, and it was turning out to be really a failure.
And every man went to the grim task of delivering a shattering blow.
But the propaganda of the day was far from the truth.
Colossal Manchesters with their tons-heavy bomb load prepare to fly with Halifaxes. Stirlings, Halifaxes, Manchesters with Wellingtons and Hamptons. Great British names for great British planes. Armourers and ground crews scramble over their charges like a cluster of industrious single-minded ants, intent on nothing but their immediate work, the loading of high explosive bombs. From the southeast, distant watchers will see a cloud of Manchesters rise and will idly wonder where they are going.
So far from the truth that of the 10 squadrons equipped, in all 202 aircraft, 80 were lost on operations, and a staggering 50 lost when either taking off or landing.
After creating a holocaust, the daring return. Each flock to its own particular roosting. At their journey's ends, there may be exhilarant cackling, but no crowing.
When the twin-engine aircraft failed, one really felt that our position from the offensive point of view was in a pretty hopeless state. Well, normally that would have been, one expected, a question of putting the whole lot on the scrap heap and thinking again. But if you think again when the designs of aircraft are concerned, it's a long process. And you've still got to be sure that what you've been thinking again over comes out right in the end.
However, my father had designed a 4-engine version, and Mr. Norbert Rowe, a senior ministry official, told me that he and other officials came to AVRO's, and my father showed them how he could lengthen the Manchester wing and install 4 engines. And thus, said Mr. Rowe, your father snatched victory from defeat.
The fuselage and tail, with its strange central fin, later to be discarded, were already standard Manchester parts. And with the new Merlin engines, a prototype was ready in just 2 months. On January the 9th, 1941, the prototype flew, and the Lancaster was born.
But AVRO's did a marvelous job in converting that twin-engine machine into the 4-engine Lancaster, and that, beyond any doubt, was the best bomber in the way of performance, comparative ease of flying under the worst conditions, and in the vast loads. It was literally the camel's back which never felt the last straw. There was nothing, really, that we couldn't put on that aircraft. I never heard any crew talk about the flying characteristics of the Lancaster, otherwise than in words of praise for the way it handled and the way it behaved and the reliability of its 4 Rolls engines. I think personally, and what I think in that regard has been supported by a lot of the people who really were in a position to know, I think it did a major part in winning the war. The Lancaster brought the real facts of war home right into the enemy's heartland. And I don't think any other machine would have survived the attempt to emulate what the Lancaster managed to perform.
Down a little, 230, steady, 230, steady, down 235, stand by to pull me out of the seat if I get hit. Steady, 40, steady, hold it, steady, 235, hold it, 240, hold it, 235, that's fine, 235, hold gun!
Guy Gibson was one of the many close contacts Chadwick had, which he regarded as essential to production, and both worked closely to perfect the attack on the Ruhr dams with Barnes-Wallace's unorthodox bouncing bomb. It was incredible that the Lancasters of the specially formed 617 Squadron flew the 300 miles to their targets without rising above 80 feet to deliver their stunning blow from just 60. The water released into the surrounding countryside flooded war factories up to 40 miles away and severely hampered others.
In June 1943, just after the Dambuster raid, there was an investiture at Buckingham Palace, and Queen Elizabeth, who is now Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, presided. And she decorated Wing Commander Guy Gibson with the Victoria Cross for his part on the raid, and she made my father commander of the British Empire.
Their work, after all, looking back on it, and judging by messages that I've had from such people as General Montgomery, Winston Churchill, and others of that ilk, certainly goes to show that the Lancaster took a major part in easing the other 3 services. For instance, Rommel, who commanded the enemy forces against us when we were landing there, he sent a message to his superiors saying, "Stop the bombing or we cannot win."
Diese 5000 Kilogramm Riesenbombe wird in britischen Fabriken hergestellt.
But of course they couldn't. 7,375 of Roy Chadwick's Lancasters were built and delivered some 600,000 tons of high explosives and more than 50 million incendiary bombs. 156,000 sorties were flown over enemy territory, using more than 228 million gallons of fuel. 59 squadrons used Chadwick's Lancaster, from massive saturation raids to precision attacks using the heaviest bomb constructed. The 10-ton Grand Slam, used operationally for the first time and seen here against the Bielefeld Viaduct on March the 14th, 1945.
Of course, the Shackleton of today is the direct descendant of the Lancaster, and the AVRO Lancaster, which I think most of the enemy commanders and important people on our side, like Sir Winston Churchill and General Montgomery, will admit took a major part in winning the war, was really entirely due to the genius of Roy Chadwick and his men in AVROs. I wonder myself whether Chadwick has ever had sufficient recognition of his major part of he and his team in winning the war.
As the war progressed, my father designed a larger version of the AVRO Lancaster, and this was called the AVRO Lincoln.
The success of the conventional Lancaster, the imminence of and eventual fall of Germany, forestalled any sense of urgency in its development, and it wasn't until the war in Europe was over that the Lincoln was ready for squadron service. With the sudden end of the war with Japan, the need for a heavy bomber force no longer existed, and many Lincolns were simply put into storage. And with the end of the Lend-Lease agreement with the USA, withdrawal of the Liberators left Coastal Command with an urgent need for a long-range land-based aircraft, the sea-bound Sunderland flying boat having proved inadequate. For Roy Chadwick, the immediate solution would have been to convert Lancasters, but they lacked sufficient range and were far too small. Alfred Stewart was AVRO's experimental manager.
In 1946, Mr. Chadwick had received a specification for an airplane that would act as a coastal command aircraft. The more he looked at the specification, which was to convert a Lincoln into this role, the more he got disillusioned with the idea. He then set about mocking up in the experimental department a new conception of a fuselage. He kept this very secret for a long time. Eventually, he persuaded the ministry, as he always did in his Lancashire approach to the subject of airplanes, and he then started to design the beast and finished off with this wonderful aircraft, which has survived the very many years.
But then, at the pinnacle of his career, whilst testing a new advanced passenger aeroplane, Roy Chadwick's life ended abruptly.
The last day of my father's life was Saturday, the 23rd of August, 1947. He and Bill Thorne and the rest of the crew boarded the Tudor II and took off. And the aeroplane rose to 100 feet in the air when Bill Thorne turned the aeroplane to starboard. What had happened was that the night before, someone had been detailed to change some wiring that ran out to the ailerons, and this had, unfortunately, been reconnected in reverse order. The pilot, with great presence of mind, had switched off the engines, and the aeroplane was rushing across the field. All, I think, would have been well, but in the middle of the field there was a large dew pond surrounded by trees and bushes, and the nose of the aeroplane broke off on contact with the trees, and the pilots were flung into the pond and drowned. And my father, who I understand had been in the cockpit behind the pilots, was flung out at about 60 feet and died of a fracture of the skull.
The death of Roy Chadwick is a sad blow to Britain's aircraft industry. His work designing the Lancaster had earned him the right to his country's gratitude. He died as much in the service of his country as a soldier, sailor, or airman in wartime. Roy Chadwick's death was indeed a sad blow. But his legacy, the then unfinished Shackleton, lives on.
It's rather nice for me to be sitting in this cockpit again after 34 years. Well, that was the initial flight. On that day, of course, everybody had to be there. The managing director, the chief designer, the project designer, the engineers, the aerodynamicists were all always very interested in the first flight of any aircraft. Now, I must say that after the preliminary adjustments, everything went well.
And so on March the 9th, 1949, Roy Chadwick Shackleton took to the air. At the time, no one would have thought or believed that this basic type would see constant service well into the 1990s.
The flight was very similar to the Lancaster, to the Lincoln. They flew all in the same comfortable way. I can't say that I've had a bad control in an AVRO aircraft. They've always been well harmonized. And during that flight, it was a pleasure to maneuver the aircraft in all the ways we were required to do on the first flight. And at the end of the flight, to be able to put the undercarriage down and the flaps and approach in an exceedingly similar manner to the other Lancaster and Lincoln aircraft. And in fact, the whole first flight was a great success. Well, since then, the aircraft has performed for some 30 years. The aircraft had a wonderful record in the service and is still at it, and maybe still at it for another year or two. But after 34 years, I reckon that's a very great record for an aircraft out of the AVRO stable.
The Shackleton saw much service in the early 50s, and in August 1957, the new Mark IIIs continued in the maritime role of the earlier Marks I and II. The altered wing shape and added fuel tanks provided a new dimension. They could now cover 200,000 square miles of ocean in a single flight, and with improved crew accommodation, the Mark III appeared to comply with all the new requirements. But when the new aircraft entered service, it wasn't without its problems. Shortening of the bomb bay to make way for the tricycle or nose wheel undercarriage resulted in a high incidence of nose wheel failure and unsatisfactory stall characteristics. Now, with the introduction of the Mark III, the Royal Air Force, with its increased number of Shackletons, was able to employ permanently Mark IIs in the Far East. Earlier Mark Is were returned to RAF Kinloss in the United Kingdom for conversion to T4 standard and used as maritime operational training units until 1968. Suddenly, in 1958, the Shackleton was vaulted into a new age. Operation Grapple, mounted from Christmas Island, called upon the Shackletons to perform meteorological reconnaissance for nuclear tests. In the Yemen, the Shackleton had not forgotten the lessons taught by its forebears. In 1964, in the wild and mountainous area of Rad Fan, 35 miles north of Aden, dissident tribesmen had effectively closed the Dala Road, the main trade artery from the Yemen to Aden. With our long-term Arabian Peninsula policy in mind, Rad Force, as was known, was given the task of making the Dala Road safe, and plans called for maximum use of air power. over 3,500 bombs were dropped by Shackletons of No. 37 Squadron, as they gave support in true Lancastrian style. Performing a multitude of roles, the Shackletons flew the British flag to the far corners of the world. Goodwill tours served to improve political harmony, as well as being a showcase for British military aviation. By carrying full complements of ground crews and spares, the detachments gained valuable training in being highly mobile, self-contained units, able to move far into Commonwealth lands at a moment's notice. In Malaysia, the Shackleton played a prime role as it gave the ground forces continuous air support. But as Britain's influence around the world continued to dwindle, the Shackletons, after 20 years of constant service, were decommissioned. But then, with the loss of the aircraft carrier airborne early warning system, Britain was again to turn to Chadwick's aging Shackletons.
Mission 03, vector 360, flight level 230, call pre-brief. Scramble, scramble, scramble.
03, scrambling.
In the late 60s, HMS Ark Royal was withdrawn from service, and the RAF at the same time undertook to provide airborne early warning for the fleet at sea. To do this, 12 of the Shackletons, which were being phased out of the maritime role, and which still had sufficient life on the airframes, were cobbled together with the radar from the Gannets that flew from HMS Ark Royal. The Shackleton was reborn, but only as a stopgap until the new AEW Nimrod was ready to enter service. Basically designed in the decade of the 40s, Chadwick's Shackleton more than holds its own in the war games of the 90s.
Nothing on radar yet. Airplane now at Angels 28. Your target is 180, 30,000. 03, roger. 03, your target now 360, range for 45, start at 360. 03, roger.
I think I've got in contact at 10 right, level.
Further contact bearing 5 miles.
Identify 1 Badger, modified Charlie, flight level 300, heading 180.
03 Shadow.
Target entering a port turn. 03, shadowing.
Roger, for your target turning away. Clear to return to base now.
03, returning to base.
Great.
On a day-to-day basis, the Shackleton operates with fighters. Fighters that tend to look at them with a slightly jaundiced view. The world is full of fast jets and it's all about wings and the sun. And the Shackletons, as an anachronism droning along, are looked at sideways with slightly bemused eyes. But nevertheless, in peace, they actually carry out their wartime role. They preserve the integrity of the United Kingdom's air defense region, escorting others that shouldn't be there out of the area. Roy Chadwick's legacy, this Lancaster-derived Shackleton, is, it seems, destined for yet another lease of life. The airborne early warning Nimrod, itself derived from a Shackleton contemporary, the Comet, has been, after an investment of $1.4 billion, scrapped. But as Chadwick's aging Shackletons are asked to do yet more, it surely is only a question of time before they too will be beyond service, relegated, one hopes, to a more peaceful, static life. But museums, hard pushed for cash in this day of profit means all, will only house perhaps one. Of the 8,200 Manchesters, Lancasters and Lincolns built, only 2 Lancasters survive in flying order, one in Great Britain, the other in Canada. The British Lancaster, seen here in the livery of Guy Gibson's dam-busting Lancaster, pays permanent tribute to gallant deeds as part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Of the 180 Shackletons built, only 4 remain. Their fate, unless something is done to further preserve them, is to be burnt eventually on some distant airfield fire dump.
My father came home and we always went out to greet him, and I could see him coming across the hall and going to talk to my mother with a very happy smile on his face and looking down at her and saying, "We're going to call the new machine the Shackleton, darling." I thought that my father was so pleased. My mother's pride in the fact that her grandmother was a kinswoman of the great British Antarctic explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton.
although it was designed such a long time ago, the Shackleton is still capable of being a front-line aircraft.
The designers were entirely satisfied that there we had another successful aircraft.
Shackleton's family motto, by endurance we conquer, so well describes this magnificent machine and its gallant crews, and that the Shackleton bears one of Britain's best loved and most famous names.
One is given to ask if this really is a fitting end to Chadwick's legacy.